A man's world is turned upside down when he realizes that his child's DNA doesn't match his, and what's more, even his wife's DNA didn't match the child's. How did they get to the bottom of this dilemma? Mary Fulham heard the front door slam and she was startled in the kitchen where she'd been preparing dinner for her family. The door had made such a loud noise because her husband, a towering giant at 6'7", had slammed it, and he looked furious as he walked into the kitchen. It was quite the sight for Mary, who had rarely ever seen her husband Chris this angry. In fact, she could count on her 2 hands how many times she'd seen him go off. He was the most kind-hearted person she had ever known, so his fury unsettled her. She immediately stood up and went to him. "What's wrong?" she asked, but he just handed her a letter rather than an answer. "Read this," he growled furiously before pushing past her to take the seat she vacated. He looked funny in the small chair, but Mary dared not laugh. Instead, she turned her attention to the letter, and when she opened it, she saw the results of a DNA test. Chris had always complained about how his friends joked about how different their child looked from him. The results were proof that Chris was not the father of their boy Edward. He couldn't believe that his wife had been cheating on him and making him raise another man's child. "Must have really looked a fool to you," he said suddenly, his eyes fixed on her. "I've been catering to a family that was never mine." "Chris!" she yelled. "How could you say such a thing?" "Tell me it's not true then," he thundered. "Tell me it's some sort of mistake that you never laid with another man and passed his ilk off as mine. Tell me." "Please believe me, Chris," Mary sobbed. "I could never love another man, much less lay with one. There has to be some sort of mistake. I just ask that you trust me." "You want trust? How about the 100% trust doctors and everyone else in the world puts in DNA tests?" Chris asked. "It says that ain't mine, but you who have never invented anything in your life think there's a fault somewhere. You're not Mary. You just didn't get a bun in the oven thanks to some higher being somewhere, and you clearly didn't get him from me. My question is, who was it?" "Chris, how can you say this?" Mary sobbed, hurt beyond words. "Is it Kelvin from your gym, Mr. Woods at the vet's shop?" Chris asked, his voice rising an octave with each question. The argument increased in volume until their poor 5-year-old son woke up. Wondering what was causing the racket, he wandered toward the kitchen, but as he neared, he heard his father say he hadn't fathered him and then heard him walk out of his crying mom. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew 2 things. His mom was unhappy and his father had just denied him. The following day, Mary made a trip to the hospital out of righteous anger and took a DNA test. To her shock, the results also proved she wasn't Edward's mom. This baffled her. This was not the result she was expecting. She was certain Chris was Edward's father, and now she just learned she's not his mother? How could none of their DNAs turn up in a search? She called Chris and revealed the news as she left the hospital. She also sent him a copy of her test results, and it shocked him. The best thing they could do was return to the maternity hospital where they welcomed their baby 5 years before. They met the nurse who helped during the delivery, but the woman tried to avoid the topic. "Listen here, woman, we've had a pretty noisy row about this, and we have DNA evidence that says neither of us had anything to do with making Edward. If you don't come clean now, I'll reveal the truth," Chris growled. Cowed by his intimidating figure, the nurse gave them directions to the family who had ended up with their biological son. "I'm sorry, but someone mixed up the newborns and it was too late when we discovered it, so there was a cover-up. I would have reached out, but it would have cost me my job. I'm sorry," the woman cried. Chris had no sympathy to offer, so he turned and walked away. However, Mary spared the woman a reassuring smile before she followed. They traced the address, but Mary got cold feet when the time came to meet the family. "Do you really think we should be doing this?" she asked as they sat in the car. "Of course, we have a right to know at the very least," Chris replied. "Why don't we take things slowly and knock first?" Mary knocked after a few minutes and a strange lady opened the door. Behind her, holding onto her skirt, was the child Mary and her husband had come for. He looked exactly like Chris, and the mother noticed immediately. "How is this possible?" she asked. "Why don't we explain over tea?" Mary suggested, and the woman who introduced herself as Martha agreed. When Chris and Mary revealed everything to Martha and her husband Joe, they told him to go away. "If you ever want to get in touch, you can reach us here," Chris said as he left his business card. They didn't expect a call, but the very next day, Martha called Mary and told her she wanted to meet. At their meeting, Martha explained that the kids weren't furniture that could just be exchanged or moved. They couldn't just switch kids, even if they'd been raising one they didn't conceive themselves. Chris saw sense in her words, so both couples decided to keep raising the child fate brought to them while remaining friends and keeping in close contact so they could also witness their biological children growing up. Chris apologized to his wife for blaming her unjustly for cheating. He loved hearing Edward call him daddy, and he thought his wife was the best in the world.